The Germans called him a fool. His own commanding officers thought he'd lost his mind. But on a frozen morning in December 1944, deep in the Ardennes forest where the snow ran red and the Reich made its final desperate stand, Private First Class James Henderson of the 333rd Field Artillery Battalion did something so unexpected, so utterly defiant of every rule in the Army manual, that it saved his entire unit and turned the deadliest enemy marksmen in the European theater into ghosts haunting their own forest. This is the story of how one black soldier, armed with nothing but audacity and a refusal to die quietly, turned the predator into prey, and proved that genius often looks like madness until the smoke clears and the bodies are counted. December 16, 1944. History would remember it as the beginning of the Battle of the Bulge, Hitler's last great gamble to split the Allied forces and turn the tide of a war he was already losing. But for the men of the 333rd Field Artillery Battalion, one of only 2 African-American field artillery units to serve in combat in Europe, it was the day the forest came alive with death. They'd been stationed near the Belgian town of Wereth, supporting the 106th Infantry Division, when the German assault came crashing through the fog like a steel avalanche. Panzers rolled through villages, paratroopers dropped from winter skies, and in the trees, hidden like demons in the white wilderness, the snipers waited. German snipers in the Ardennes were not ordinary soldiers. These were Gebirgsjäger, mountain troops trained in the Alps, men who could lie motionless in the snow for 6 hours, who could judge wind speed by the flutter of a single leaf, who could put a bullet through a man's eye from 400 meters and vanish before his body hit the ground. They wore white snow capes that made them invisible against the birch trees. They moved through the forest like wind through grass, and they were hunting. James Henderson was 23 years old, born in Greenville, South Carolina, where he'd learned to shoot cans off fence posts with his grandfather's rifle, and where he'd learned something far more valuable, that the world would underestimate him every single day of his life, and that survival meant being smarter than everyone assumed he could be. When the Army drafted him in 1942, they sent him to Fort Bragg, where black soldiers trained in segregated units, slept in segregated barracks, and were told by white officers that they lacked the intelligence, the courage, the discipline to fight alongside white troops. Henderson never argued. He just listened, learned, and waited for his moment to prove them wrong. Now that moment had arrived, wrapped in terror and gunfire. The 333rd had been overrun in the first hours of the offensive. Communications were down. Supply lines severed. The battalion scattered into small pockets of desperate men trying to survive in a forest that had become a killing ground. Henderson found himself with 11 other soldiers, black men from Georgia, Alabama, Texas, Louisiana, huddled in a frozen ravine as German forces swept past them like a tide. Above them, in the trees and ridgelines, the snipers took position. They didn't rush. They didn't need to. The Americans were pinned, exposed, and the snipers had all the time in the world. Over the next 6 hours, 3 men died. Thompson took a round through the throat while trying to radio for help. Garcia, light-skinned brother from New Orleans who'd almost passed for white back home, caught one in the chest reaching for his canteen. Williams lost half his face to a bullet that came from nowhere and everywhere at once. The survivors couldn't move, couldn't return fire effectively because they couldn't see the enemy. Every time someone shifted position, a shot rang out. Every time someone tried to crawl to better cover, the snow beside them exploded in a spray of white and red. The snipers were playing with them now, taking their time, letting fear do half the killing. Henderson lay pressed against the frozen earth. His M1 Garand clutched to his chest, watching his brothers die one by one, and something inside him shifted. Not broke, shifted, like a gear clicking into a new position. He'd spent his whole life being told what he couldn't do, what he wasn't allowed to attempt, what wasn't his place to try, and every single time he'd found a way around it, through it, over it. Now pinned in this Belgian forest by invisible killers who thought they held all the cards. He realized something that should have terrified him, but instead filled him with a strange, cold clarity. The Germans didn't see him as a soldier. They saw him as prey, which meant they would expect him to act like prey. He turned to Corporal Davis, the ranking man left alive, and said the words that would become legend. "I'm going to do something stupid. Don't follow me. Just be ready." Davis stared at him like he'd already died and didn't know it yet. "Henderson, you move and you're dead." "Already dead, Corporal. Been dead since Fort Bragg. Just ain't laid down yet." And then, before Davis could stop him, James Henderson did the impossible. He stood up. Not slowly, not carefully. He stood up in full view of 3 separate sniper positions and started walking forward through the snow. his rifle held loosely at his side, moving with the casual gait of a man out for a Sunday stroll. He didn't run, didn't duck, didn't weave or dodge. He walked like the bullets didn't exist, like the war was a bad dream he'd decided to ignore. The men in the ravine thought he'd snapped, lost his mind to fear and cold and watching his friends die. They waited for the shot that would end him, but it didn't come. What Henderson understood, what his years of being underestimated and overlooked had taught him, was that snipers are trained to track movement patterns. They watch for the crouch, the run, the desperate scramble of a target trying to survive. Their entire craft is built around predicting human behavior under stress, the way a soldier will dart from cover to cover, the way fear makes men small and quick and predictable. But Henderson didn't move like prey. He moved like he belonged there, like he had every right to walk through that forest, like he was taking a stroll through a park back home. And for 3 crucial seconds, the German snipers hesitated. Their scopes followed him, fingers on triggers, but something in his movement pattern disrupted their training. Was he bait? A decoy? Was it a trap? No soldier walks like that in a combat zone unless he knows something you don't. The hesitation was brief, but it was enough. Henderson had counted on that hesitation, gambled his life on it. And in those 3 seconds he'd been walking, his eyes had been working. Not looking for the snipers themselves, that was impossible, but for the signs of their presence. The tiny disturbance in the snow on a branch where a rifle barrel rested. The shadow that was slightly deeper than it should be in the hollow of a fallen tree. The absence of birds in one particular section of forest. He'd been hunting rabbits since he was 8 years old, and his grandfather had taught him that sometimes you don't look for the animal, you look for the space where the animal is hiding. On his 4th step, Henderson saw it. A white snow cape draped over a position in a cluster of pines 40 meters upslope. Just a slight irregularity in the pattern of white, a fold of fabric that caught light differently than natural snow. The sniper was watching him through a scope, trying to understand what he was doing. And in that moment of confusion, Henderson did the second stupid thing. He smiled, raised his hand in a casual wave like he was greeting a neighbor, and dove forward into the snow. The shots came then, 3 rifles firing almost simultaneously, rounds cracking through the space where his head had been a heartbeat before. But now Henderson was rolling, moving fast and low, no longer the casual walker, but a combat soldier with a target. He came up on one knee, brought his Garand to his shoulder, and fired 4 rounds into the pine cluster. The first 2 were ranging shots. The 3rd found the sniper's position. The 4th found the sniper. Through the scope of Heraeus, her rifle, Oberjäger Greta Eckstein had just enough time to be shocked that she'd been spotted before Henderson's bullet punched through the snow cape and into her chest. She fell backward into the snow, her rifle clattering against the branches, and suddenly the invisible became visible. Behind Henderson, Corporal Davis and the others were moving now, emboldened by his insanity and the proof that the ghosts could bleed. Davis spotted the muzzle flash from the 2nd sniper position and emptied his M1 into a deadfall where the shooter had nested. Someone screamed in German. A body tumbled out of concealment. The 3rd sniper, realizing his position had been compromised, did what snipers are trained never to do. He ran. And the moment he moved, he became a target instead of a hunter. 5 American rifles tracked him through the trees. He made it 30 meters before the bullets found him. The forest went quiet. Not peaceful quiet, the terrible quiet of death, settled and waiting. Henderson moved forward through the snow, his rifle up, checking each position. The first sniper had been a woman, maybe 30 years old, blonde hair matted with blood, her eyes still open and staring at the gray Belgian sky. He'd heard the rumors that Germany was running out of men, sending women to the front, but seeing her there dead by his hand hit him differently than he expected. Not guilt he'd done what needed doing, but a hollow recognition that the war had burned through so many lives it was consuming everyone now, regardless of gender, regardless of sense. The 2nd sniper had been maybe 16, a boy with acne scars still on his cheeks, wearing a uniform 2 sizes too large. The 3rd was an older man, a career soldier by the look of his decorations, who'd probably trained the other 2 and died trying to protect them when Henderson's stupid trick had blown their cover. Davis came up beside Henderson, breathing hard, staring at the bodies. "How the hell did you know that would work?" Henderson didn't answer right away. He was looking at the German woman's rifle. A beautiful Mauser-Car 98K with a Zeiss scope, custom-fitted and worn from use. She'd been good. They'd all been good. But good wasn't enough against crazy. "I didn't," he finally said. "But I knew staying put meant dying slow. Sometimes stupid is just another word for the only option left." They gathered weapons, ammunition, anything useful from the dead Germans. They had to keep moving. The forest was still full of enemy troops, and the American lines were somewhere to the west, if those lines still existed. But as they prepared to move out, Davis looked at Henderson with something between respect and disbelief. You just walked at them. Just stood up and walked. They expected us to hide, Corporal. Expected us to be scared. And we were scared. Terrified. But my whole life, people expected me to stay in my place, keep my head down, not make waves. Got real tired of meeting expectations. The next 3 days were a blur of survival and close calls as Henderson's group tried to reach American lines through a forest occupied by German forces. But word of what had happened spread fast through the scattered remnants of the 333rd, black soldiers, cut off and fighting for their lives. Heard the story third hand and fourth hand, how Henderson had beaten the snipers by doing the one thing no sane soldier would do. And some of them, desperate and surrounded, tried their own versions of his trick. Not all of them survived. Stupid tricks don't work twice in the same sector, and the Germans adapted. But enough soldiers made it through that small groups of the 333rd began linking up, forming effective fighting units again. By December 21st, Henderson's group had rejoined friendly forces. And by Christmas, the story had reached officers who didn't know whether to court-martial him for reckless endangerment or recommend him for a medal. They did neither. Instead, they quietly noted his actions in a report that would gather dust in Army archives for decades. Because acknowledging that a black soldier had outsmarted elite German snipers using unorthodox tactics might complicate the official narrative that African-American troops needed white officers to tell them what to do and how to think, Henderson returned to combat and survived the rest of the war. He fought through the final push into Germany, saw the concentration camps that made him understand what they'd really been fighting against, and came home to a South Carolina that still wouldn't let him drink from the same water fountains as white folks, despite the fact that he'd bled the same red in Belgian snow. The 333rd Field Artillery Battalion suffered devastating casualties during the Battle of the Bulge. 11 men from the unit were captured near Wereth, and what happened to them became one of the war's most brutal atrocities: tortured, mutilated, and murdered by their German captors. Their bodies were found weeks later, frozen in positions of agony, and the world barely noticed because they were black soldiers and the newspapers back home had more important stories to cover. Henderson carried that knowledge for the rest of his life. He'd survived by being smart and brave and refusing to accept the limitations others placed on him, but survival comes with a price. You remember the ones who didn't make it. You remember their faces. You remember that you lived and they didn't, and there's no logic to explain why. No justice in the random mathematics of who catches the bullet and who doesn't. The trick he used that day became part of the informal combat knowledge passed between soldiers, though it was never codified in official training manuals. Walk like you belong. Move like the bullets don't matter. Confidence can be a weapon if you're willing to gamble your life on it. Unconventional tactics from unconventional soldiers who weren't trained at West Point but learned to survive in a world that wanted them to fail. The German snipers in the Ardennes killed hundreds of American soldiers during the Battle of the Bulge, but after Henderson's encounter, some of them became more cautious, more hesitant when engaging scattered units. Because the story spread among German troops, to of American soldiers who didn't behave according to doctrine, who moved unpredictably, who sometimes walked into fire instead of away from it, and somehow lived to tell the tale. Years after the war, a journalist tracked Henderson down in South Carolina, where he was working as a mechanic, fixing cars and living quietly, and asked him if the story was true. Had he really just stood up and walked at German snipers? Henderson, by then in his 60s, with grandchildren and a lifetime of keeping his head down behind him, smiled that same smile he'd given the German sniper before diving into the snow. "Young man," he said, "when the world's been telling you you're stupid, you're inferior, you're not good enough your entire life, and then somebody tries to kill you for it, you realize you got two choices. You can believe them and die proving them right, or you can do something so completely unexpected that they hesitate just long enough for you to prove them wrong. I chose the second option. Worked out all right. He died in 1997, buried with military honors that felt inadequate for what he'd actually done, and for decades his story remained largely forgotten, a footnote in a segregated battalion's history, until researchers combing through declassified documents and survivor testimonies began piecing together what really happened in those Belgian forests. The men of the 333rd weren't supposed to be heroes. They were supposed to be support troops hauling ammunition and digging latrines, kept safely away from real combat where white commanders worried they might embarrass the army by failing. But when the Germans broke through and the front collapsed and survival became the only objective that mattered, those black soldiers fought with everything they had. They held positions when ordered to retreat. They counterattacked when surrounded. They adapted and improvised and refused to die quietly. And at least one of them beat the best the Wehrmacht could throw at him by doing something so monumentally stupid that it somehow transformed into genius when filtered through courage and desperation and a lifetime of being underestimated. The Ardennes forest is peaceful now. The snow still falls in winter, clean and white and unmarked by blood. Tourists visit the battlefields, take photographs at memorials, listen to guides explain the strategies and movements of armies long since turned to dust. Few of them hear about James Henderson or the 333rd Field Artillery Battalion. The stories that get told are the ones about white generals and famous divisions, about conventional heroics that fit comfortable narratives. But sometimes, if you know where to look, you can find the small markers, the obscure plaques, the references and specialized histories that acknowledge what really happened, that black soldiers fought and died and won battles in ways that weren't supposed to be possible, using tactics that weren't in any manual, driven by a determination that came from knowing they had to be twice as good to be considered half as worthy. Henderson's trick wasn't really stupid. It was the calculus of a man who understood that conventional wisdom gets you killed when the enemy expects convention. It was the application of a lifetime's worth of lessons about subverting expectations, about surviving in spaces that weren't designed for your survival, about turning limitations into advantages because you had to. The German snipers were better trained, better equipped, better positioned. They had every advantage except one. They expected their targets to behave predictably. And when faced with a black soldier who refused to play the role assigned to him, who walked when he should have crawled, who smiled when he should have cowered, their training failed them. Not because they weren't good at their jobs, but because their jobs were built on assumptions about human behavior that didn't account for someone like James Henderson. War is full of moments that hinge on split-second decisions, on chaos and chance and courage that can't be predicted or replicated. But some moments reveal deeper truths about who we are and how we survive. Henderson standing up in that Belgian forest wasn't just one soldier's desperate gambit, it was the culmination of everything that black Americans in uniform had to do to survive, not just the war but the country they were fighting for. Fight smarter, move differently, never give them what they expect. Prove yourself over and over because once is never enough. And sometimes when the situation is impossible and the odds are death either way, you do something so audacious that it transcends stupidity and becomes something else entirely, a refusal to accept the world as it's been constructed around you, a declaration that you will define the terms of your own survival. The snipers in the trees thought they were hunting prey. They were wrong. They were facing soldiers who'd been fighting a war long before they ever set foot in Europe. A war against a system that tried to convince them they were less than human, less than capable, less than worthy of respect. And when you've spent your life fighting that war, the bullets in a Belgian forest are just another challenge to overcome, another expectation to subvert, another chance to prove that the only thing stupid about survival is believing the people who tell you it's impossible. James Henderson's trick beat Germany's best snipers because it was never really a trick at all. It was truth. The truth that courage and intelligence and refusal to accept defeat don't come in the color or rank or background that people expect. They come from the human heart's capacity to look at death and choose life anyway, to stare at impossible odds and try something impossible in response. The Germans trained their snipers for years, gave them the finest weapons, taught them every technique of concealment and patient killing, but they never trained them to fight against a man who'd already been shot at by an entire nation's prejudice and kept walking. That was Henderson's real advantage. Not surprise or luck or even courage, though he had all three. His advantage was that he'd learned long ago how to move through a world that wanted him dead or silent, and surviving that world made surviving the war just another day's work. If this story moved you, please take a second to like this video. It truly helps us keep these untold stories alive. James Henderson's name should be as well known as any hero of the Second World War, but history has a way of forgetting the soldiers who don't fit comfortable narratives. Share your thoughts in the comments below. Tell us if you'd heard of the 333rd Field Artillery Battalion before today. Tell us what these stories mean to you. And don't forget to subscribe to the channel to discover more real stories of black heroes whose courage changed the course of history. Heroes who fought 2 wars at once, one against fascism abroad and one against racism at home, and who somehow found the strength to win battles in both. Their stories deserve to be remembered. Their sacrifices deserve to be honored. And their genius, the genius that so often looked like madness until history proved them right, deserves to be celebrated. Thank you for watching, and never forget that sometimes the greatest victories come from those who refuse to accept defeat, no matter what the world expects of them.